Make it real now. Come on.
Welcome to this episode of our podcast, The Public University Problem, Pedagogy or Profit. Today we're discussing Paulo Freire's banking and problem-posing concepts as discussed in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and how they give us a better and deeper understanding of how knowledge and power function in the public university system here in California. I'm Adrienne, and I'll be your host for this podcast, along with my co-host, Azusana and Sophie.
The three of us are California-born first-year students at UC San Diego, a public California university. We're here to share our insight on how we, as California college students, relate to Paulo Freire's analysis of education and to bring his work into the 21st century.
We ultimately want to relate Freire's work to the way that the California public university system is functioning today, especially given the mass overcrowding that has been occurring for the past couple of years, and how this is detrimental to students. We're going to discuss Freire's work and outline his concepts about education in detail, provide some perspective from the student side of the dynamic, give a rundown of where the UC system is at with its educational tactics and how this relates to Freire, and finally explain how we have personally felt the effects of overcrowding on our own educational experience.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. So let's get into a little about Paulo Freire and who he is. So he was an influential philosopher and Brazilian educator who analyzed pedagogies, that is defined as the method and practice of teaching, especially as an academic subject or theoretical concept. And we're going to be looking at some ideas he expresses in Chapter 2 of his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, titled The Banking Concept of Education, where Freire criticizes the banking method of education and offers up an alternative. He explains that the banking method is of the most popular practice. This is where students are assumed to be empty vessels and have a singular role of consumption led by teachers who take this assumption and act with domination. He goes on to argue that knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world and with each other. In order for this to take place, he suggests an alternative I mentioned before. This he calls the problem-posing method. This is where students are student teachers and teachers are teacher students. Both bodies are learning with each other and with the world. This strategy encourages creativity and inclusivity as it values perspective. He describes this as authentic thinking that is concerned about reality, does not take place in ivory tower isolation, but only in communication. He really encouraged his audience to remember what it means to be fully human and think critically about reality and how it might be changed. And today we're going to be keeping these ideas in mind as we analyze the structure of our educational experience here at UCSD.
Yeah, it was super interesting to read this analysis of dynamics in educational settings because I, as a student, and I'm sure you guys can relate to this also, have definitely experienced both the banking and problem-posing concepts in the classroom, as he puts them, but couldn't exactly put a name to the phenomenon that I was experiencing. And yeah, like in my experience, educators have become much more aware of the benefits of using a problem-posing approach to teaching, which was especially evident in my later high school classes where I felt like I was heard more and like I interacted more with the intellectual discussion at hand rather than like how things were in middle school or even elementary school where I was spoken to rather than included in a discussion. But I've really felt the effects of the transition from smaller educational settings to an enormous public university where I've experienced a kind of regression in the educational tactics due to the lack of resources for students. Oftentimes, larger classes result in a banking concept style of teaching naturally emerging because it's pretty hard to facilitate discussion, and as a result, students are simply given information rather than encouraged to interpret or grapple with the information presented to them. We see this kind of dynamic frequently occurring at our school, UC San Diego, as well as the other UCs, which are also large public institutions, due to overcrowding.
UC San Diego is the second largest UC campus and has increased its student body by over 2,300 students from last fall.
More people that come here, it just becomes more crowded. It just becomes a little bit more difficult to maneuver.
As we mentioned before, we are currently freshmen, so we are currently taking general ed classes that usually have around 200 students in each course. Since there are over 30,000 undergraduate students, most introductory classes have a ratio of 19 students to 1 professor, according to the website Admission Consultants. Specifically, we all have a writing requirement class that has over 250 students per lecture, with 4 lectures occurring every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 1 hour. This shows how many students are enrolled in introductory courses, making it very difficult to create a relationship with a professor. I could say that in most of my classes, I have never spoken to the professor and just my TA because there are so many other students that creating a relationship would be pointless.
In relation to the lecture, we also have sections for that course 2 times a week with about 15 students per section. Because of this, we get to experience having a small and large class size, making it easier to see the difficulty of having so many students in one course. I think we can all agree that we feel more comfortable sharing our ideas when it comes to being in small class sizes compared to a 250 person plus lecture. It also just makes it difficult to pay attention when there are so many students doing many different things at the same time all around you.
For example, it was mentioned in College Factual that there are about 1,779 instructional employees, which is not about 5% of total undergraduate students at UCSD. In addition to this, there are also classes that are taught by graduate students, and they make up a great majority of teaching assistants to grade exams, homework, teach sections, respond to students' concerns. It's not even the professors who are examining the work that students provide, but just giving away information and then testing students weeks later. In relation to the large class sizes, because we're in the quarter system, everything moves at a super fast pace, giving little time to comprehend what we learn in each lecture. I think we can agree that if we had smaller class sizes, but we were still in the quarter system, we could definitely understand the material better.
Like any other university, the number of undergraduate students increases every year, which is very unfortunate in being able to solve the large class size issue. If universities decided to not over-enroll students every year, they could focus on making sure that the current students were getting the teaching method that they learned from the most. As Ferry discussed, the idea of students just being filled up with knowledge that they gain no benefit from. The purpose of higher education is to get educated, but this will not occur if we are just being put into one big classroom to fend for ourselves. Different methods of teaching can help students, who all have different manners of learning, to receive the education that they are paying for.
Yeah, and in addition to the large course sizes, getting into the classes that you need is another problem that comes with this. We're given times to enroll in classes depending on the amount of units that we have, which makes it unfair for some students to get in the introductory courses that are needed. Most classes fill up very quickly, which can push you behind a year in some cases, where you need to take a lower division class as a prerequisite to get into other courses.
Yeah, just like personally, I've not been in many lectures where I felt comfortable enough to speak just because of the sheer number of people in the room. The only times I've really spoken in lecture were for classes where people eventually stopped showing up by the end of the quarter, and there were only about a quarter of us in the lecture hall. And another component of the enormous class sizes that's challenging is when lecturers are attempting to monitor attendance. It seems that the point of mandatory attendance is to encourage student participation and give them a deeper understanding of the course material by coming to in-person lecture. And the 2 ways that I have encountered mandatory attendance in large lectures were the use of iClickers and the strategy of assigning lecture cards at random times throughout the quarter. iClickers are understandably not always a first choice for lecturers, given that they create inequity in the case that students can't afford them, because they're pretty pricey, upwards of
like
60, 70,
yeah,
something like that. And lecture cards, which are used by the aforementioned doc, reinforced this kind of sense of ultimate authority for lecturers who would just assign them at their will when it was convenient for them, which created resentment on the part of the students, right? Because they felt like they were being policed for this class that, they didn't necessarily choose to be in. But yeah, significantly smaller educational settings would make it much easier to track attendance while also giving students an opportunity to participate in the intellectual conversation, which to me is far more appealing and would give me more of an incentive to go to class than when someone is just talking at me.
Yeah.
As Sophie said before, I totally agree with that. In most lectures, I never speak just because there are so many students that I just don't feel comfortable enough. I would say that all of the most of the general ed courses that we are mandated to take for our college include smaller sections of students, which is where I think most of the learning occurs. Personally, the only time that I get to feel comfortable to ask questions is during these smaller classes. As we move up into upper division courses, the number of students stays the same of about 200 plus students, but doesn't require a smaller section as part of the class. Specifically, I am taking an upper division class where I have never met any of the TAs because there's no way to reach out to them outside of office hours. I, however, completely understand that they do not make these choices and could also be graduate students, so they are trying to manage everything at once. This is just one example of how large class sizes impact students' ability to make personal connections with professors or other instructors.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you guys about the lecture experience. I'm going to look a little bit at like the smaller group discussions, which I think are like still better, but I think it's important to like examine some of his ideas in like the large class settings versus the small. And I feel like there still remains a struggle to deviate from the banking method as I enter into these spaces with the understanding that I will be following like the instruction of the TA. Specifically in one of my classes, I found myself using the discussion to just like get a better sense of how my TA will go about grading my material.
Yeah.
So I like alter it to please them and like make sure that I'll hit all of their like opinions. And it just feels like very unnatural and like necessary. I don't know. It's like for being successful in terms of grades. I think this is because the student perspective is not valued in the sense that like there's not time or like effort set aside to really like understand the student and their unique take on the assignment or discussion. So I also think grades just play like a really large part in encouraging the banking method of education. It's like a part of this predetermined structure that we all understand and accept coming into university because of our previous experiences like in elementary school and middle school and even high school. And I think that the fact that the structure is so complex, from the way material is being presented to the structure of the lecture hall and the grading system, there just like isn't much space to challenge the structure, and it's definitely a limit situation.
Yeah.
But to end on a more positive note, I think some things I've noticed in these small groups that have made my experience more enjoyable is that like they fall in line with Freer's problem posing alternative. They're like small things, but I think interesting to look at. In one of my classes, to start the discussion, we like start the day with a random question, whether it be like our favorite movies or like boba order or like how we got our name. And I think it's just like a fun way to remember that like we're all human and like ground ourselves in this like routine environment. And I think there's like a lot of things we can take from that, and that like there can be these small adjustments made, like not like a big system-wide change that can still like change for the benefit of the student. And I think that's like a good specific example of how a smaller environment are able to support the idea of like remembering what it means to be fully human and engage with our peers on a more genuine level. And I also like how like this class, LATI 10, creates this foundation of respect with like accessibility from like Zoom to in-person options to participate, late work, discussions that are extra credit to facilitate like in like just interaction overall, and encourages us to like formulate our own ideas and connections without too many restrictions. And I also like how our professor will always respond to comments with like respect to make anything fit into conversation, like even if it isn't totally on topic.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate how you're bringing it back to progress, right? Because we're talking about how, currently there's the issue of class sizes getting bigger and just less resources, but on the flip side of that, I think, kind of like I mentioned before, there is more awareness about how just these like more collaborative styles of teaching are, really beneficial to students. But yeah, these experiences that we have all highlighted throughout are ways that we have experienced the banking method as defined by Freire. And as students who are beginning higher education but have also finished high school education, this idea that Freire has discussed can be supported by the ways that we've been taught for years. So, we have a wide range of perspectives throughout our careers as students. And specifically, the course that this podcast is for, LATI 10, has been one of the few examples, like Adri said, where students are able to express their thoughts without the punishments of getting bad grades if our ideas don't match up with professors, and also, like Adri said, just gives us more opportunity to participate and feel more comfortable participating.
This concept of the banking system can be changed if we continue the grading policy of this class to all courses that are needed in higher education. It can also change just by doing what we are doing now, by creating a dialogue that brings attention towards some of the systematic problems and inspiring conversation / bringing awareness to them. Having conversation with professors of TA with small course sizes is also a way to eliminate the idea of power belonging to only professors. Students and professors both have the collective means to learn from each other, giving more power to knowledge instead of the power dynamic between them.
Yeah, thanks guys. I'm Sophie.
I'm Adrian.
And I'm Asusana.
And this was the Public University Problem, Pedagogy or Profit.